Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I will do my best.
Okie dokie. So we are 8:01. My assistant has started streaming this. We also stream it. Um, so Evelyn Kirkley, tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
I teach at the University of San Diego in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. I have been a faculty member there for, I think it'll be 27 years come January. So I've been around in San Diego for quite some time. And there have been ups and downs at USD, but for the most part, I would say it's been a pretty good gig.
I would agree, and that's where we met. I remember I was thinking this weekend, how did I actually get in your class? Kat Reuter is a good friend of mine, and she kept just raving about you. And I signed up for Cults and Sex, SECTS. To be
right, I always say that, yeah.
But you might draw more students if it was the other, but
well, true.
And it was such a great course, and I thought this weekend, to ask you, what's your favorite thing to teach?
I will say what has become my favorite thing to teach is a course that I created called LGBTQ plus and Christianity. And I've only been teaching it, gosh, I think since 2017. It took a while to get the course approved.
I thought USD approved that. Wow.
It did. And what I love about it is that we look at all different sides of sexuality, sexual and gender identities, as related to Christianity, those Christian groups that are pro, those that are con, that we look at the folks who are in Christian ministry fighting for the rights of queer identified folks, particularly trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming folks. And so what I love about the course is it is very timely. Students are there because they want to be there, and it's really exciting because one of the things I ask them to do is to look at their own understandings of their own gender, their own sexuality. And so it gives them the opportunity to do some self-reflection as well.
Awesome. So since 2017, it's interesting because for years I was a guest speaker up at Cuyamaca, speaking on primarily gay and lesbian and bisexual issues. And we decided probably in 2015 that that particular course was not needed anymore in that college. How have you seen the climate change at USD over the years?
Well, it's kind of two different questions. The climate at USD for LGBTQ plus identified folk, when you and I were there and when I first started, it was total invisibility. We did not exist. Then it moved
Two of us did. Joe Colombo on staff,
right,
on faculty,
right.
and me in the student population.
That's right. And then it moved to what I lovingly call hostility and violence. There were acts of intolerance. I know you got death threats. And so as soon as we were visible, there was a totally hostile and antagonistic reaction. Then after that, it kind of moved to kind of bare knuckle tolerance, gritting
a really good way of putting it.
If we have to have you here. And then it has moved toward more inclusion. Before I leave, and I'm hoping that we're moving in the direction of real value, celebration, and authentic welcome. But we are not there yet, but we've come a long way. I'll also say, you mentioned the course at Cuyamaca. My course has changed a lot because we started out looking really at a very binary view of sexuality. You're either gay or you're not gay, you're queer or you're straight. But I've really expanded to talk a lot more about asexuality, aromanticism, polyamory, the trans community, and the whole trans umbrella. And so we've really expanded to look at much more about the whole spectrum of different identities around gender and sexuality, pan issues. It's just the language evolves much more quickly than I can keep up with. And so, and the other thing that we do a lot more with now than we did originally is intersectionality. And so looking at what is it like to be Black and queer that is different from what it is to be white and queer? How is an Asian lesbian's experience maybe different from, say, an older white lesbian? So really looking at how the different identities that we all bring really do intersect in ways that make our experiences different.
And then tie it into Christianity.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
Do you get any pushback from more traditionally minded students?
Not much.
I'm guessing it's an elective, right?
It is an elective, and I think students have a sense of my reputation and who I am before they get into the class. So probably not too much of that. What is really interesting, in order to provide a more balanced sense in the class, I'd have a guest speaker in who speaks from a very traditional Roman Catholic perspective, and talks about, really believes that if you're going to be gay, you must be celibate, and there should be no inclusion or celebration. And so, for the first time when I taught this class in spring of 2019, I got some pushback there. Students objected to giving airtime to a conservative speaker.
Well,
And
because they exist in the conservative world.
exactly. And I was like, these are the people who you are going to be working with, who, if you are a religious person, that you are going to be dealing with in communities of faith. So much better to know, what are they saying? What are they thinking? So that you can really know how to engage with them. And respectful dialogue is really important to me. And I try to model that by having this speaker in who has been extremely critical of me, who has attacked me online, who created a whole website called Alumni for Catholic USD, whose sort of main point was to attack, kind of having a drag show at USD, or a lot of the different things that we've tried to do there.
I'll ask you offline who that is.
Okay, yo, sure, yeah.
And it just occurred to me that I'm curious if there's a faculty member there that was not so great with me, that is, if he's still there.
I'm happy to tell you. Hopefully not.
All right, so I love that, and it just in the first 10 minutes that kind of gets us where we are now. What's always fascinated me about you, though, is kind of your personal story and how you got here. Mm-hmm. So where'd you grow up?
I grew up across the country as a military child. And so my dad was career Navy, and we really moved across the country with him, except when he was stationed in places like Cuba or Vietnam. We had to stay stateside. But I kind of grew up coast to coast, and it wasn't until, gosh, I didn't complete a single grade in the same school until I think 5th or 6th grade. Had multiple high schools and junior high. So the longest time I ever spent until I was an adult was 4 years in the same college.
Wow. Wow. And what did you study?
I was an American Studies major and a religion minor. And my idea, I went to school in Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, and I thought, I want to go into museum curatorship, material culture, archival studies. And when I started working in Williamsburg, I discovered that that field, at least to my mind, felt very elitist. It felt kind of snobby. It wasn't dealing where people are hurting. It wasn't present with people who are suffering. And so I pivoted at that point, and I went to seminary in New York City, where I was able to be involved in social justice ministries. I worked with a shelter for homeless youth near Times Square. I worked with soup kitchens, and I got a whole different view of Christianity as a kind of liberation theology and as a way to say and live out the idea that Jesus is on the side of those who are oppressed.
And I have to say, two things you just said. I'm so grateful for my years at USD. And certainly I had my ups and downs too. But between you and Pilar Aquino and Helen and Joe, I never saw Christianity as liberation theology, nor did I get the ideas of social justice through religion, through Christianity, until my exposure to you guys. And that changed my entire world. So thank
Me
you.
too. Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, so seminary. What
Seminary.
was your plan?
My plan was to go into church ministry and then you sort of spread this idea of social justice. Well, there were two obstacles there. One, the denomination I was a part of at the time was the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States.
Wait. How did that happen? How'd you choose Southern Baptist?
I grew up as a Southern Baptist. That's my parents, and that was kind of the one place as we were moving around in the Navy all over the place, we always attached to a church, and it was almost always a Southern Baptist church because there were Southern Baptist churches all across the country wherever it was we were stationed. And so so I had sort of the fervor and the enthusiasm of being a Southern Baptist, but it is also an evangelical, pretty much fundamentalist denomination now. And when I decided to go to seminary, they were not allowing women to be ordained. So I ran into a big roadblock there as far as becoming any sort of minister. And then I did get a job in a Presbyterian church as a youth minister. And there I ran into a really common experience that is living in the fishbowl. And I hated being scrutinized for what I wore and, who I lived with and what my personal life was like. This is even before social media was scrutinizing me, were all those things.
That's what happens when you become a leader, no matter where you are.
Well, that's very true. But I really, the judgment from a group of people that were supposed to be like loving and non-judging really bothered me, and I knew that I needed some distance. So it was at that point that I started doing some teaching and with my master's degree, and I immediately loved it. So I really felt like that was my calling. And so I went into a doctoral program in American religion. And again, some ups and downs along the way, but I felt like I'm very fortunate that after a couple of wrong turns or roadblocks, I really found what is my vocation.
And how would you define that? I do believe you were put on the planet to teach. But how do you define your vocation?
I define my vocation as a teacher. And sometimes that is, well, with the research demands of being a PhD academic, that is sometimes not well received. But I chose to teach at USD rather than like a large research oriented institution like UCSD or San Diego State, so that I would be able to focus my work on students, teaching, helping to work with them, be present with them as they are growing, as they are developing in this really critical time for most of them between the ages of 18 and 22. And that it's been such an honor and a privilege to do that. And I don't mean to say like, oh, I'm up here leading everybody and helping them develop their best selves. I have learned so much. I've learned much more than I could ever have taught my students over the years.
Okay, so let's go. And by the way, you are phenomenal. So just own it.
All right, thank you.
What have you learned? What have been some of your biggest lessons?
I have learned to be more compassionate and empathetic. with the idea of not making assumptions about who my students are. And, I see them, they're mostly these young, good looking, fit,
Wealthy,
beautiful,
wealthy.
wealthy, privileged, mostly white people. And I bring my own judgments about who they are. They're from Del Mar, they're from Scottsdale, they're from Boulder. And I've really had to learn that their lives contain a much larger amount of trauma than I would ever have expected. From divorce to suicides among their loved ones to severe economic hardship, especially after 2008. And so it sounds trite to say, don't judge a book by its cover, but I really learned not to judge students by this like good looking self presentation that they work really hard to maintain. Nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong. But so it's helped me to develop a greater sense of compassion, of empathy. It's also really, what else would I say? It has also taught me that young people today deal with an extraordinary number of stressors that I never worried about. When I was in college, I never worried that I was going to get a job. I never worried that I'd be able to support myself and rent my own apartment, have my own bank account. It just wasn't even a concern. But students today are much more worried. They are anxious about what their career choice is going to be. How am I not going to be living with mom and dad after I finish this degree for the next 30 years? And so I have learned that the pressures that they're under, particularly professionally, but also personally, how am I going to find a partner? How am I going to, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? Where is meaning in my life? Where a generation or two back, a religious community often provided that sense of kind of ultimate meaning. Young people today are the fastest growing group of, demographers call them the nuns, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E. That young people today are the largest and fastest growing group of people who have no religious affiliation. So some of them are atheists, some of them are agnostic, but most of them would characterize themselves as spiritual, but not religious. And without that sense of kind of what is a well defined sense of what is ultimate meaning for them, they really struggle. So I guess,
And I had not even thought about that, Evelyn, but
yeah,
not only the meaning, by the way, that's not just kids. I'm seeing it more with 40, 50, 60 somethings that I'm working with,
true.
really confronting that lack of meaning. But the sense of community that a religious community would give you is also missing. So those bonds, where can they fill that void?
Exactly. And now with social media, their community exists more and more online. And there's a whole additional set of pressures there. How they oh gosh, I
Oh, I
can't.
cannot tell you how many times I've said, thank God we didn't have cameras on our cell phones when I was,
I know. So they have to groom and curate their online identities. And then everybody looks great. They're all having beautiful lives. And students are not going to confess their mental health, their mental wellness, their suicidal ideation, the real struggles that they're having out into the blogosphere. And yet they feel this kind of pressure to present this sort of happy, thriving self. And again, I have learned that that is a in my mind, that's a really false sense of community. And so, teaching remotely and working remotely, I'm working really hard to how can we form community when we do not see each other in person?
Yeah.
I'm working on it.
Yeah, we've been doing the same thing, so we can talk about that offline.
Yep.
It took a while, but I now feel that we're more connected in my business world, which is primarily my social world too, than we were prior to Corona, but it takes some tweaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So we went into kind of lockdown situation March 20th, and school was in session. So
Right.
what happened? What was your initial the thought process at the university level, and what happened with classes and students and everything in March?
We had spring break the first week of March. It was unusually early this year. And then when we came back, the news was all about COVID in China. It was just starting to come into Washington and Oregon. Hadn't even really hit New Jersey and New York yet. And we're coming back. All students have come back from wherever they were over spring break. And there's this kind of intense anxiety on campus. The university kept us in session for a week and then said, all right, we're going online for the rest of the semester. Everybody go home. And then they gave faculty a week to put all of their course materials online. So we started going online teaching. I think it was the third week or fourth week of March for the remainder of the semester until the middle of May. And then
I have to believe that created a lot of anxiety, because I haven't been in college in a long time. But my experience was that my professors weren't all that tech savvy.
Absolutely. And so as I talked to students as the semester went on, their anxiety skyrocketed once they went home for a couple of reasons. One is some faculty thought, oh, now we're online. I'm going to give you more work since you're not seeing me in the classroom. So they felt like they had even more work to do. Number two, a lot of them felt like being at home merged the helpful separation that they had between school life and home life. And now they aren't in the dorms where they could go down the hall and say, now, what did you get on that math problem? Or, oh, can we study together for that religion quiz next week? They felt totally isolated. And their families, when they were home with families, they had the experience of being home with family. But now they had to navigate home and family time with now school time. I think they really felt lonely. Nobody knew kind of how to connect with each other in classes except via Zoom. So I think anxiety, and then grades, sort of how is going online going to impact my grades? That was a huge, huge stressor. And ultimately, to the university's credit, they allowed every student to take classes pass fail, any classes pass fail, and they didn't have to make that decision until, gosh, the beginning of May. So they had almost the whole semester, and they could do pass fail if they wanted to. And I think that was a great thing that the university decided to do on behalf of student anxiety.
Yeah, that is a great thing. And when you were saying that, I do remember, Evelyn, out of all my 6 years at USD, I never had a professor give me more work than you.
Well, I still have that reputation. Demanding what I
just had a little traumatic memory come back. Actually, probably half of the books in my office are your fault.
Well, I'll take credit for that.
Yeah. Okay, so now you guys got obviously through the semester, and then we had summer. Yep. How have you been dealing with it? What's been your personal experience about coronavirus and just the anxiety that we as adults start to feel?
Multiple levels. My partner is over 65. My mother lives in Phoenix and is 87. So just in my own immediate circle, I was concerned. I'm not too far from 65. I'm 59. And so I will say my first anxiety was, how am I going to teach these students? And I was not very confident in my ability to Zoom. I'd never held a Zoom meeting before. And so I did my classes mostly asynchronously. And now I kind of regret that because it did mean less contact, less personal real-time contact with students. But in addition to worrying about my own health, and can you hear those beeps?
Yeah, but they're not bad. But
I want to figure out a way to get rid of those without like muting myself. Okay, I'll ask you about that online offline.
right.
Um, so Mm, Um, I was worried about my friends, my family. My personal experience is that I have stayed home most of the time. I particularly quarantined so that my mother's retirement community would allow me to visit her in Phoenix. And I had to quarantine for 14 days before I went over there. I had to have a COVID test the day that I drove over there, couldn't fly, had to drive. And then I had to quarantine with my mom until my COVID results came back, which ended up being after the regular 14-day quarantine period anyway. But I'm an introvert. I like being at home. It's felt like less pressure. Like I don't take a shower every day. I sort of feel like I don't have to be on quite as much since I've been able to be home. So it's been some anxiety and stress, but over the summer, particularly, I've been reading. I've been mostly reading and then trying to get outdoors at least once a day, playing with my dogs, hanging out with my partner, with my wife. And so mostly trying to re-energize because I knew I was going to be entering this fall, not knowing if I was going to be totally remote or hybrid and trying to prepare for both simultaneously.
Right. So, what are you teaching this fall?
I am teaching two courses. One is called Great Moments in World Religions. The other one is called Saints and Sinners in American Protestantism. And I'm super excited about both these classes because I'm using a unique style of teaching. I'm using large scale interactive role playing games. And I've done this before face to face, but doing it, sort of putting it all online is going to be a little bit more, it has been a little bit more challenging.
I want to go back to school. You're exciting me. It sounds so much fun.
It's so cool. Yeah, it's
Uh,
super fun.
all right. So now we get through, not through, because we're not through Corona, but we acclimate to the new changes, and then George Floyd happens.
Right.
So again, occupying the space in this world that you do, what has been the impact of that for you?
Um, Even before George Floyd, about 2 years ago, a group of students called me out, took the courage and vulnerability to call me out for being a racist. And really, I was the advisor for our undergraduate LGBTQ plus group. And this group of students who identified as queer students of color really felt like the space within the group was largely white and that they had not felt welcome there. And I will tell you, the experience of being called out by these students, and, very kindly, very nicely.
They do it, Evelyn, because
Yeah.
number one, that's amazing. And we're having this conversation often right now. Oh my gosh, if something happens, what do we say? So I think that can be very instructive.
It happened in a couple of ways, some more dramatic than others. Um, First, our president resigned, and just sort of without really any additional information about why she resigned. And then I sort of heard through back channels that it was because she felt like she alone, as a woman of color, as a Black woman, was doing to have all of the work within the group of trying to raise its consciousness and to try to help build a sense of more intersectional community and be a more welcoming space for people of color. Then we had a meeting where where students of color who identified as queer attended and just told us why they weren't involved with the group. And so this is 4 or 5 students who range from first year to graduating seniors saying, as Latinx, as Black, as Filipinx, they did not feel like Pride was a welcoming space. And since I've been the advisor for Pride and have been a huge force in what it looks like, what it does, how it identifies itself, its whole brand, and some actually told me personally, you are part of the problem, Evelyn. You are not doing enough to make Pride a welcoming space. And it was so hard. I felt humiliated. I felt distressed. I felt angry. I felt defensive. I was like, I am working so hard here to, I reach out. I talk to individual students of color who come to Pride. I try to involve them. We try to reach out to other groups. We try to create these sorts of programs. And you might notice in all of those the word try.
Well, anybody who's on here right now, I'm hoping we have a rule in our company. We get rid of try.
Well, that's what I was doing. And I also noticed really 2 things came home to me, maybe 3. One is I was trying to be non-racist when the opposite of being a racist is not being a non-racist, it's being anti-racist. And so that was a major aha moment for me. That second, that my approach to being inclusive was individual and it was relational. So I was reaching out to individual students to try to build relationships with them, to try to get to know who they were. But I was making 0 public statements about how important it is for us to be an anti-racist organization. Third, I had what is a very common defensive line was, well, the Black Student Union isn't reaching out to me as a queer person. They're not reaching out to us. Why should we be reaching out to them? So that calling out and recognizing those 3 aspects of myself really set me on a path of self-reflection and self-discovery. So I have used the last 2 summers to just try to educate myself and do a lot of reading, a lot of podcast listening to videos, and I'm not done yet. I am not cooked. I am not woke. I am an aspiring anti-racist. And I hope that I will be aspiring for the rest of my life. And so when George Floyd initially happened, I was like, this is interesting. I wonder what's going to happen. And then, like so many people, I saw the video and I was like, oh my fucking God. Oh, I should say, is that all right to?
It's all good. Yes, you're fine.
Okay. Okay.
I think that was an appropriate response to that video anyway. So
I was like, oh my fucking God, what is happening here? And then when I heard that the way that the police reported the incident really was 180 degrees different from what we saw on the video, and then starting to see the protests. And then what I started thinking about was, in my sphere of influence, in my community, in my university, what can I do? And then, and I hadn't come up with any brilliant ideas, but then at USD, a group of Black faculty wrote a letter to the university administration and talked about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, others who have been murdered by the police for no reason that I could see other than being Black. And they included 12 action steps that they felt like the university should take in order to be more anti-racist. So I got involved as part of a group of white aspiring anti-racist faculty. We call our group AWARE, Aspiring White Anti-Racist Educators. And so I got involved with this group of white faculty who are really trying to help Black faculty in this cultural transformation, in implementing these 12 action steps, and then, whatever happens after that.
We can only do what we can do, right? Would it be possible to forward me that letter?
Sure,
Or the
absolutely.
12 action steps?
Yep. You may have seen it's gone out widely on alumni networks, but I am happy to, let me write it down.
I signed a couple of the petitions that went
Yeah,
out, but I don't think I've seen that one.
yeah, happy to, sure. So some of the action steps, and I'm just going to name them because they may be things that could be adaptable for your work and the other folks who are on the call. One was to implement anti-racist training for every employee, student, faculty member, administrator, and we haven't figured out how to do that. If it's kind of like we have a sexual harassment training that we have to do online every semester, and it's not bad. It's not super interactional, but
I'm remembering, do you remember Tom Cosgrove?
yes, of course.
Years and years, I mean, this was probably 94. It was just after the death threat thing with me, and they had a push for some reason for more multicultural education, and we did a 3-day retreat up in Mount Cuyamaca somewhere.
Right.
That maybe connect with him.
Yep. It was the human relations weekends.
Yeah.
I did one on campus. I didn't go off campus, but I did one on
Oh man, that was intense. That was intense and awesome.
Yeah. They dropped those several years ago, partly money and partly they were getting so much pushback that it was pushback from students, pushback from faculty. That sort of the idea of being culturally competent. A lot of folks are like, we have a Black president, race is
No
done.
problem. Yeah.
I've heard the same thing. There's no more sexism. Women are in every part of our lives. I'm like, yeah, right. So mandated anti-racist training. Another one was additional scholarship opportunities for Black students. A third was to diversify our board of trustees. A fourth was to be much more intentional and conscious about recruiting, not only recruiting, but retaining Black faculty. We've hired a lot of Black faculty over the years, and a lot of Black faculty have left over the years. And to really look at that dynamic are why these amazing scholars and teachers leaving USD when we have worked so hard to get them here. Another one that I thought was really interesting was find ways to compensate Black faculty and other Black employees for all of the additional work and time and energy that they devote to doing anti-racist education at the university with things that white people don't even have to think about. Black faculty are really laboring under. And I have a sense of what that looks like after devoting many hours over the years to working with queer students, with the kinds of things that they experience on campus, in the classroom, in the dorm, when they go to interview for jobs. So that's a little bit less now, I think, as campus culture has changed, but Black students, some of the things that they experience, hearing the N-word frequently, sort of like we used to hear, that's so gay. Back in the 80s, the N-word is all over the place. And because it's used by Black folks in hip hop, particularly, white students are like, oh, it's okay. I'm just quoting a hip hop lyric. I'm just quoting Kanye there. And Black students are like, no. And that was another one of the action items was to create effective protocols to identify, do education and sanctions when racism happens in the classroom and between colleagues. So so the action steps were totally reasonable, totally doable, with a little bit of money, and like many things, they have been, oh, they've not been wholeheartedly embraced, I would say, certainly by everyone in the administration or all faculty.
Yeah. Well, there's the steps to change, right? So first step is awareness.
Yep.
That's what's being brought. Then that it's happening in our country, in our company, in your university. When anything challenges the status quo fights for its survival. So
Absolutely.
It's going to be uncomfortable till change happens.
Yeah. And I've become more aware than I ever was how white supremacy is, enacted from the highest levels. That, particularly the lack of transparency, where I have no idea how budgets are developed or how much money is spent for X, Y, and Z. I have no idea who would be in charge of an anti-racist educational protocol. Who would do that if it was going to be done? If we were going to create scholarships, who would do that? And so this kind of mystification of who does what, how much it costs, what the lines of communication are, and what the lines of power are, has been really discouraging. Because, people have power that sometimes it goes with their job title. Sometimes they have a job title, but no power. Sometimes they have a job title and they have a lot more power than the job title might suggest.
Yeah. It's very interesting. And people cling on to their power. They do not want to let that go.
Yep.
So what books, you said you've been, well, let me go back. One thing you just said, when this all started to happen and I started to read a lot more on racism, including How to Be an Anti-Racist, which has now become one of my favorite books. Mm-hmm. I was so angry, and I've given up a lot of anger, and I still have moments of being angry because of how educated I am. I'm very proud about my education through USD. And I didn't know this history, not to the extent that I know it now, because it's been so whitewashed in our educational system.
Yeah.
Is that my hallucination, or do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with it. I, like you, I've had to learn and relearn, Black history particularly, but also the history of any Black, Indigenous, communities of color. They're just not in the history books.
Yeah.
And so it comes as a surprise and a disbelief. I remember when I first heard about the massacre of a Black middle class community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, like 1913, 1920. And I was like, nah, that didn't happen. If that had happened, I would know about it.
Exactly.
And so I disbelieved the student who was telling me about it. So I immediately go online. I'm like, okay, yeah. Sorry, never mind. And so it had to. Yes, history has been whitewashed. I think also the way that white people are often educated, both socially and institutionally, is we just take our whiteness for granted.
Yeah.
And our ability to walk anywhere, go anywhere, and sort of be in charge, or
that's the privilege and the supremacy, right? That we're not aware of.
Yep, absolutely.
So what books would you suggest?
I have also read How to Be an Anti-Racist. Other books on my shelf, I really was impacted by Waking Up White by, oh dear, I should look on my shelf, by Debbie somebody. She was born around the time that I was, so around 1960 in New England. And she talks about what it was like to come to consciousness about being white. White fragility, was, again, enormously important. And I know it has been hotly critiqued in some quarters, but it really exposed to me the many kinds of attitudes that I have from being white that are not shared by all people. So Kendi's work, So You Want to Talk About Race, by Oluo or Oluo. Here, I should look on my bookshelf. There's a fiction book that I really enjoyed. It was called The Underground Railroad by Colton Whitehead. And it's a novel, but and sort of the idea in the novel is that the Underground Railroad during slavery there was an actual railroad. And so it sort of brings this metaphor to life, and it traces different modalities of slavery and really does not spare any of the brutality and violence of it. So I really enjoyed it and found it powerful. Oh, and in terms of movies, one of the first things I did after George Floyd was watch Ava DuVernay's 13th.
Yeah.
And it's been out a couple years, but it was really amazing.
Amazing, impactful, and at times hard to watch.
Really distressing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I always kind of come to the end of these by saying, what's next for you and how can we help you?
That's so nice of you. Well, what's next for me is getting up to speed. A steep learning curve for me about taking my courses online. I start a week from tomorrow. And so I'm desperately trying to discussion boards, blogs. I made a little video, like introduction video of myself, like I would usually do on the first day of class. I did that this weekend. I was like, oh, it worked. In a little bit longer term, I am getting ready to phase into retirement. So I know this makes you feel old, and it does me too. But in next fall, after I'm 60, I can start a 5-year phased retirement where I gradually reduce the amount of my teaching, and then will retire completely when I am 65 in 5 years. And so where I would love help from your community is I'm trying to figure out what's next for me in retirement. I would love to be involved with social justice. I would love to be involved in anti-racism. I'm not going to have the sphere of influence of a school. I'm not sure that I want to be involved in teaching or education, but I really want to volunteer in places where I will be challenged to grow and learn, and where I can be doing good for the world. So maybe Habitat for Humanity. They're anti-racist organizations. I've also thought about here in San Diego becoming like a volunteer where you work as a court-appointed advocate for a young person, so I could learn about the legal, about sort of how law enforcement works. Sounds depressing and awful, but to be a CASA volunteer. So there are a couple of things that I've thought about, but I welcome all suggestions. I see retirement as something I am moving toward and not something that I am moving away from. But I'm sort of feeling like what I want to give and where I can be of the greatest service for students is beginning to come to an end. And I'm really excited about what's next.
Awesome. Awesome. And by the way, you will always be teaching. You just will. It just may be a different kind of vehicle for it.
Yeah. How I think of it is I always want to be growing. I always want to be learning. And if I can learn with other people and they teach me and I teach them, I want to take a comedy improv class.
We've done that in our real estate office. And as soon as, hopefully, once we get back to somewhat normal, we can do it again. It's so much fun.
I would love to do that. Yeah, yeah. Learn Chinese, learn to tap dance. Oh my gosh, there's lots of interesting kinds of things. I see in the chat that if I have written any books, I have one published book. It was my dissertation, so not exactly an Oprah's book club selection.
What
But
was the topic?
here is the title. It was called Rational Mothers and Infidel Gentlemen. Let's see, Gender and American Atheism from 1860 to 1920. So it's it again, my dissertation, looking at atheists between the Civil War and World War One, and really looking at how they understood gender. I don't know if I have another book in me, but I do on course evaluations. People say, you've got so much energy, and also you're demanding, you require so much, you're a tough grader. So all the things that I like to hear.
Yeah, all true. And I would love to see you write. I think, and Cassidy has said you have great energy, and she's always like this. always up.
Caffeine and fueled, I have to say, but
Yeah,
that's all right.
well, and when you're teaching some of what you teach, like you just said, your dissertation probably wasn't the most exciting, except you bring your energy to it. So it is exciting. I'd love to see you write.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that affirmation. That is something I will put in my cooker to see what to do, what I could say that would be unique and different.
Robert, who's kind of like my brother, says, did Ashley ever say her dog ate her homework? Mm-mm.
No, I don't think so.
That's a pretty good student.
Yeah, you're a pretty good student. You were a very regular attender. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Not everybody was quite as serious a student as you were, as far as taking this education not for granted, but really taking it seriously. Totally from Robert's words, absolutely. Ashley was front row in the center, raising her hand.
I still am. Our company is very learning based, so we get to experience a lot of classes, and that hasn't changed.
Oh, I also really appreciate the recommendation in chat to do a podcast. That I would, and maybe you and me, Ashley, doing a podcast.
Oh, I would love that.
It would be so much fun to do something together, and from our diverse, but also in some ways similar perspectives. Doing a podcast would be super fun. Yeah, I'm down.
Awesome. Well, thank you for saying yes this morning, starting our Monday off with high energy. And yeah, we'll connect. I've got page and notes, of course.
That'd be great. Yep, me too.
Well, we'll connect and get the additional questions answered. And yeah, let's talk about a podcast. Are there any other questions from the audience that we have this morning before we get off into our days?
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for saying yes. I love you. I'm so glad we reconnected.
It's wonderful to reconnect. Yeah. And, we went to Greece together over 20 years ago. We sat at the navel of the world at the Oracle in Delphi. We were at the Parthenon. Oh my gosh. That was
the Omphalos. That's my favorite place on the planet. The Oracle at Delphi.
It's amazing. Yeah. So I'm thrilled to reconnect after many years.
All right. Tell Jill hello.
I will.
And we will talk soon.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.